Hello, and welcome back to CouchLit. I'm Sarah Skorick.
Maria.
Oh, cut me off.
Let's fight. Go
ahead.
I'm Maria Sasa.
And I'm Peter Forrest.
All right. This episode 3, I'm going to be leading, and I'm going to be talking about something that I've been interested in throughout my time reading coming-of-age novels and just novels in general, and that's about landscape and how landscape affects characters. So, as we've learned through these past episodes, we're talking about Jeanette Winterson's novel, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, and Jakira Diaz's novel,
When she sees this,
Ordinary Girls. I'm so sorry, Jakira. I'm so sorry. It's been a long day. Yeah, and so when I was reading these novels and in our kind of thoughts and discussions about them, I became super interested in how these characters are influenced by their landscape and how they also come to influence the landscape around them. So kind of to start off with Jeanette and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. Throughout the novel, we learn that Jeanette grows up in a small European town. A quote that I have pulled is on page 164 of the novel, if anyone happens to have it.
For those keeping score at home.
Yeah.
Pull out
Trivia.
your books.
A friend of Jeanette says, "When did you last see your mother? I don't know how to answer. I know what I think, but words in the head are like voices underwater. They are distorted. Hearing words as they hit the surface is sensitive work. You will have to be a bank robber and listen to the little chicks before you can open the safe. What would have happened if you stayed? I could have been a priest instead of a prophet. The priest has a book with the words set out. Old words, known words, words of power, words that are always on the surface, words for every occasion. The words work. They do what they're supposed to do, comfort and discipline. The prophet has no book. The prophet is a voice that cries in the wilderness, full of sounds that do not always set into meaning. The prophets cry out because they are troubled by demons." I think that quote in particular was just super interesting to understand Jeanette and where she's coming from, particularly in her relationship to her landscape and her town, is because she can only think of this small town in such a complex way. I think if a lot of us were asked, why didn't you go back home, we would have been coming up with simple answers and would have thought of how we felt, but ultimately might not have had feelings such as Jeanette's. So we understand that she has a lot of complex feelings regarding her hometown and, her family there. So also within her small town is the influence of her mother and the church that she goes to. So this is why when she discovers her likeness of girls, she doesn't really question it or think it's bad because she was never really told otherwise. In this small town, she was not exposed to all sorts of hetero or homosexual couples. It was mostly heteronormative tendencies.
Except that shopkeeper. That's her first experience.
Yeah, and so, and her mom doesn't really introduce her to these things because why would she? Except for what Maria said when she comes across these shop owners that she takes a likeness to. Her mother's like, you cannot see them, they're not on the right way, that sort of thing. And that's when she kind of subconsciously, I think, begins to understand how these relationships and sexuality is at work within this town. But ultimately, this landscape and her, her closeness to these people and how this town is influencing her is important because God is very important in this town and in this circle that she's in. And because it's so small, she doesn't have exposure to anything else. And as a result, she doesn't really question God or her reliance on God or why she's paying so much attention to God. She begins to find solace and comfort and enjoys going to church, enjoys going to these church activities, because they're ways for her to meet people and for her to have fun and to enjoy the aspects of church and God and religion that she likes. a quote that Peter had said in the previous episode when he was talking about his point, that also I think I pulled that relates to this is, I miss God. I miss the company of someone utterly loyal. I still don't think of God as my betrayer. And I think that ultimately also shows again how she comes to rely on God in this small town and how it is all around her. And were you gonna say something?
I was just gonna say, I think what you were talking about with like the smallness of her town and the way that she is so entrenched by religion and she doesn't want to know anything more and she can't know anything more. It definitely plays in when she's introduced to other people like Melanie, and Melanie says she's going off to college, and Jeanette says like, why are you doing that? Don't you know that everything there is wrong? It's all heresy and stuff like that. And she said, yeah, but I'd like to meet people with the other perspectives. And Jeanette just doesn't have that experience at all.
Right.
Like she's so like tunnel vision on her own life and everything that she's been fed, all the lines she's been fed and all the doctrine that she's been just had to absorb her whole life. And she's just like, I don't see another way because it's all wrong.
Right.
And I think the landscape definitely, like, that's why that has such a place in that. It really locks her in, because her, and that's why the doctrine also is part of the landscape here, because the doctrine locks her mental thinking and thinking, you know, there are these mission trips and things like that, but me as a missionary, when I grow up, that's my thing that I'm going to be, and that's going to spread so far and wide, and that's going to be my moving, you know, moving around is delivering my sermon. She loves writing sermons as she grows up, so yeah, I think she's locked by the landscape of where she lives, and also by just, you know, by the doctrine that is in that place.
Right,
you know?
right, and that connects to the point, my next point, which is the first relationship that she had with a woman was a girl that she knew from church, and subsequently all the other relationships that she has with women while she's in this town are with other women who are involved with the church. And so it's just super interesting to think about how in this landscape, in this environment that she's been placed in, her exposure to homosexual tendencies or her own sexuality is from the church, the one place where she is exiled from because of her sexuality. And it just kind of shows how she is ultimately between these two sorts of places in her life, and she's trying to live in between both of them because she doesn't see how they're separate. She just sees them as parts of her, but everyone else around her in this landscape is telling her, Jeanette, you can only be one way. You can either love God or be sinful and love women. And to her, that just never makes any sense.
Well, I think something that you can see with like Elsie, her elderly friend that she stays with often before she's in and out of the hospital. She finds her through church, obviously. And even though Elsie regularly attends church, she's the one that is often offering her house as a place to stay, especially when she's with Melanie. And that's, she says, like, she tried to protect you, like, the one teacher says, Elsie tried to protect you, she tried to give you, like, a safe haven, but, like, you know, you were too obvious, you did this, you did that. But it's interesting to see how people within her church some of them do try and look out for her, even though they're still within the confines of that religion.
Right. Precisely. And I think, too, that kind of goes into another point of mine, which is how gender roles come into play within this community. We see how she is expected to be of one sort of type of woman, and that's one who is very, like, dominated and is, you know, in line with everyone else, and she's
normal.
Right. She's expected to be like her mom, who is a devout religious woman and doesn't do any sort of sinful activities, only, you know, is on the straight and narrow path, and
emphasis on straight.
And so it's interesting to think about how all of these things kind of come together, and there are all sorts of roles and things placed on her by society, by other people. But as she kind of struggles to find her place within these different avenues of her life, whether it's God or homosexuality and stuff like that, she goes to nature for comfort and finds a lot of solace there. So on page 128 of the novel, she says, "My mother wanted me to move out, and she had the backing of the pastor and most of the congregation, or so she said. I made her ill, made the house ill, brought evil into the church. There was no escaping this time. I was in trouble. Picking up my Bible, the hill seemed the only place to go just then. On the top of the hill is the stone mound to hide behind when the wind blows. The dog never worked it out, used it to pee against or to play hide and seek with me, but still stood, having a Peter moment, but still stood, ears flattened and water-eyed, until I slung her up in my jacket, warming both of us." And that's just one instance where she often takes herself to these places of solitude within nature to kind of think about the things that were going on, and how those places are often without judgment and without these expectations, and she can kind of just be herself and think about how she ultimately belongs with God, but not in the sense that everyone else is coming to think of.
I think it's fascinating when you're talking about gender roles to actually consider Jeanette's role in the novel, because I think that it's pretty unique, because her mother is very much domineering in their relationship with her dad, and by her own admission, by the mother's own admission, she says, like, oh, he doesn't like conflict, like, bless his heart, he's so meek, blah, blah, blah. Like, he's barely in the novel. He shows up maybe, like, once or twice.
Right.
And, like, you know he's there, but he's not a central figure at all, especially not in the way that the mother is. He cannot compare. And she is so naturally predisposed to leadership positions, which he has to later recant when the priest is like, we can't have any more women minister kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's so interesting that Jeanette's mother actually sets her up for a deviant position in her life, because she says, oh, well, typically a woman would be set for, like, you would have to have a good husband or whatever, but don't worry about that because you're going to seminary and you're going to be a missionary. So it's so interesting that her mother is like, while she's like, you have to conform to this, she's actually setting out a separate path for her.
Right.
And she's like, this is what normal people do, but this is what you're going to do because you're the exception. And then she actually is the exception, but not in the way that her mom wants.
Right.
And I guess that even connects back with the idea of landscape, of like the landscape of your life, you know, but like just the way that things set up. And another coming of age theme with landscape and with everything is like your parents and like the path that is set up for you. And you know, even noticing things like, you know, her mom is a very, you know, very domineering person, and then like how that affects her and how that goes with her. And I think you'll see that in, you know, lots of coming of age stories, of just how the parents set up for their child and what they think of their child to be, influences them.
Right.
And I think that can be seen.
Right. So just kind of in our talks of gay youth, I kind of took it upon myself to do a little bit of research into just statistics about young gay adolescents. So from the study Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Youth in Community Settings, some points that I picked out that I think really kind of exemplify or amplify Jeanette's case. The one stat is they studied 194 lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth aged 21 and younger who attended programs in 14 community centers to determine the personal challenges they faced due to their sexual orientation. So that's just, you know, the basic of their study. So the first awareness of sexual orientation typically occurred at age 10, but disclosure to another person did not occur until about age 16. And we see that with Jeanette, with her mom. Something important within this study, and I don't think was exactly talked about with Jeanette's novel, but something that can be kept in mind with Ordinary Girls, is suicide attempts were acknowledged by 42% of the sample. So a lot of homosexual, queer youth are having suicidal thoughts or tendencies.
So that in Ordinary Girls.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A lot.
Right. So the disclosure of lesbian, gay, or bisexual orientation to someone else and subsequently to significant others in one's social networks can occur at nearly any point in the lifespan, although typically the processes of coming out have been presumed to begin in young adulthood. So that's another thing, obviously, that's important to Jeanette's story. For lesbian, gay, or bisexual adolescents, risks of rejection from peers and from family members are particularly important. A study found that 41% of gay male sample had lost one friend because of sexual orientation. So it's kind of known that a lot of queer youth are afraid of how people are going to respond to their queerness. And then most importantly, when asked about the first person told about their sexual orientation, most did not mention a family member. 3/4, or 73%, first told a friend. Few tell professional people such as teachers or counselors, 5%, or co-workers, 1%, or clergy, 2%. Almost all describe telling their parents about themselves as troubling to varying degrees. So 26% say somewhat troubling, 24% say very troubling, and 43% say extremely troubling. So I think that particular fact really goes to show Jeanette's story and how she was never one to really tell her parents. And I don't think she really had friends to tell in the first place, but it seems like Elsie was her closest friend, and Elsie had the inclination to know that Jeanette was queer.
I think coming of age does more than just the generic like relatability, and I think these stories do more than just generic relatability, because it's very easy to be like, I mean, like, as a queer youth that has to come out, being like, oh well, this is gonna be hard, and people are gonna, this is gonna be bad for my life, you know what I mean? Or not bad for my life, good for my life, but bad. I'm gonna get a bad response. This is gonna be, but there's no way that, I mean, at least especially in today, like, there's no way it's gonna be like, well, no one else has had to go through this before. Of course they had to go through this before.
Right.
So reading these novels for young queer youth is extremely helpful for that reason, for that relatability, because it does help. I mean, regardless of whether you know that other people have experienced it, reading about it feels better.
Right.
But at the same time, it goes even farther than that to kind of like to validate, like, like I said last time, kind of like the reflections on it and understanding of it from like an older perspective of someone who has done it. I mean, I think talking to someone who did have to come out before, and what it was like, and just the wisdom of passing down, going through that experience, I think is more than, in writing especially. I think it helps. Yeah.
Well, I think that this is kind of jumping back a little bit. When you're talking about the family expectations, I was thinking about Ordinary Girls, because we mentioned Jeanette's, but obviously with Ordinary Girls, there's that whole section where, and I won't spoil it because I will mention it a little bit in my episode, but a little teaser. Basically, one of the more important things that Jakira mentions that her father tells her about, or that her father repeats to her over the years, is like, this is not the life I had planned for you.
Yeah.
And like, we were just talking like directly about Jeanette's mother planning out this whole life for her, and the way that it doesn't turn out the way the mother expects.
Yeah.
But I think it's such a common theme in coming of age novels, where it's like, I'm not doing what my parents want to do, I'm doing what I want to do, or the struggle between, like, I want to make my family proud, but I also want to be authentically me.
Right.
Which I think Jeanette definitely deals with in her decision to leave the church, because
Right.
she still strongly seeks her mother's approval, even though her mother is so
Right.
vehemently against her sexuality.
Right.
She stands her ground, and she's like, yes, I could be just staying with my religion. I could just go back to the church and everything would be fine, but it wouldn't be me.
Right.
It wouldn't be what I want to do. So,
Right. And I think that just goes back to the sense of landscape too, and how, maybe that particular landscape isn't for her.
right.
And something I think I wanted to mention too in regards to this is how when she finally leaves home, and she's been kicked out of her house by her mom, and she is looking for something else to do, and she goes to another place. We never really hear a lot about that other place. Like, we don't get stories from her living in this other area. We barely even know that she left, besides these conversations that she has with a friend, and this friend asks, why have you not gone back?
Right.
And so I think that's important to understand, is how so much of her story and of her being is tied to this place, and her existing outside of this town, this small little European town, is just completely different. And how when she goes back for the first time, how she's taking in all of these feelings and places and people that she's known for her whole life, and how they feel so different, but she feels different, but they're the same.
Yeah, I think something that I was just thinking while you were saying that is that it's so interesting how static her town is. Basically, when she goes back to it, she says, like, I wonder if I had ever even left, because everything seems exactly the same. And even as she reconciles with the differences, like, her mother is no longer doing the Society for the Poor, whatever, it's disbanded because of all the embezzling, whatever, money laundering, or whatever it was.
Some sketchy stuff.
Yeah, like, even as she goes through that, and, like, encountering, like, the exterminator lady, and she's like, well, I'm about to burn down my shop because
I'm about to commit arson.
so poor. But I mean, it's so interesting to see the ways in which, like, so much of her growth is tied to the fact that she gets out of that place. And I think that's really important, speaking broadly for a lot of queer stories. The idea of getting out of the place that's basically you've been shackled to your whole life. I think that's it's so intrinsic in these stories, where it's like, I have to leave to better myself. I have to leave to be myself.
Yeah, you saying that actually, like, kind of sparked something in my head about what I was talking about earlier, because you were talking about how she, like, went back and revisited all these old people that she had already seen. And I think, to the point I said earlier of it's more than just a validation. It's more of just like you're not the only one experiencing this. It's like a time thing, because I think, like, while you're, like, in these coming of age novels, these queer coming of age novels, you think that's, like, time is just, like, grinding by or flying by. It can be either way. But, like, I think it's just like a testament of, like, that these things are still going to be here, like, time is still it's going to keep moving. And I think, like, because while she's having her coming out thing, there's things that are happening while she's, thinking about coming out, talking to her parents. There's other things that are happening in her church. Her mom's busy with something. There's things going on all around the town, so she still has this sort of sensory things around, and it's overwhelming for her. And it's the same thing with Shakira. Just a lot of issues with her mother, and then, like, she goes and hangs out with her girlfriends, and she's like, when am I attracted to girls? And then there's all this other stuff. So I think that can be part of, like, the blinds as well of that I talked about in the first episode, or the second episode. Of just, like, those things in the past that just kind of distract. And,
So now, kind of moving on to Diaz, and understanding her kind of landscape and where she was from. So I think we've said before, she was from Puerto Rico, but she moves to Miami. But while she's in Puerto Rico, as a child, she kind of talks about those neighborhoods that she grew up in, and how they were some of the poorest and roughest parts of those towns. But she was able to find people that she loved and understood throughout the noise of everything else. In particular, she talks of a friend named Eggy, who she never saw again after she ended up moving, but is someone who has come to have such an impact on her childhood that she includes him in her memoir. A quote that I have is, "This is where I begin. I come from poverty, from El Casero Padre Riva, the government housing projects, and there are stories here I never want to forget." So we understand how these neighborhoods and these places where people would often never want to find themselves are where her stories begin and where she finds herself placed and kind of start her journey.
And that intersects with that article you brought up earlier about, all those statistics about, gay, lesbian, bi, queer youth, and the things they face, and those things crossing paths with this impoverished area and just places where she grew up.
Exactly. And then, when she moves to Puerto Rico, after her mother and her father split, she finds herself traveling between both houses often, and the two different atmospheres that those houses have. So with her mom is, what's her mom, like
She's schizophrenic.
Schizophrenic, yeah.
Might have, maybe it's her, or maybe it's her that has
she's
bipolar.
Yeah, she's battling mental health issues. She's heavily addicted to drugs. She's very violent in nature and starts a lot of issues. And then
she finds herself in a lot of scrapes with a lot of men.
Right.
That Jackie and Elena have to deal with.
Right.
And their children.
Right.
Elena being her sister.
Yeah.
Right. But then when she goes to her father's house, she's dealing with her brother, who she doesn't really have the best relations with, and she physically
him, ultimately.
Yeah. She's physically fighting him, and
spoiler.
Yeah.
He lives. To be clear.
But regardless, she's kind of facing both of these really violent situations, but they ultimately also have their own sorts of things that come with them, because she has a really hard time identifying with her mom, who's white. But when she goes to her dad's house, she identifies more with her dad, who is fully Puerto Rican, and her grandmother, and to that culture. And she often idolizes her father as well and wants to be like him. And that's probably where she gets her source of love for literature and writing, because he was such an avid scholar. Mm-hmm. And so this is another quote I have from her, where it says, "Every time I leave Mommy, I tell myself I'm never coming back, only to end up right back where I started. I leave and come back again and again. Mommy, like my family, is Miami? Oh, that's Miami.
just so you're not talking about the mother.
Oh my gosh.
Miami.
Okay, well, she calls her mom Mammy, but this quote is Miami. Apparently, I'm illiterate. So let me restart. Every time I leave Miami, I tell myself I'm never coming back, only to end up right back where I started. I leave and come back again. Miami, like my family, is a place you learn to love and hate simultaneously. You can find yourself leaving it your whole life, but never manage to leave. Spend the rest of your life going back to it and never really get there." And I think that's just such an overall important topic for her, is her connection to Miami. Specifically Miami Beach, because she relays how often she spends her time there, whether it's she's literally sleeping there overnight because she can't stand to be in the house with her mom, or she's there with her friends doing, their fun stuff or whatever. And so it's just a place where she finds solace, and she's connected with herself there. And even later on in life, when she comes back to Miami Beach, she talks about how when she is battling insomnia, she goes to the beach late at night to walk around, so she can try to clear her head. So ultimately, though, she's shifting between these physical locations throughout her whole life. She doesn't really have a steady place to be, and she's battling that internally and physically, outwardly. But ultimately, within these places, she finds herself connected to those people and to those stories that she finds in those places. And those are what kind of seems to be grounding things for her. Obviously, her book is called Ordinary Girls, and it's about those friendships with other girls who are in the same sort of situation as her. But, you know, like, she creates this sort of light in all the bad that's going on. So...
Yeah, I think something that noticed me, like, as we've been talking about both of these, is that even though they like, Jeanette has sort of her early, lesbian, like, lovers and relationships, and Jakira has her ordinary girls, there is still this, like, loneliness, to them in their landscape, in where they're placed, whether it be, isolation from God or their parents or, family and everything.
Right.
I think that is all just really set up, by that landscape and by where they are.
Right.
What I think is so different about the two novels is, not to bring a Portrait of a Lady on Fire, but if you've ever
welcome to.
If you've ever seen that film, there's one man in it. He shows up for all of 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And it is so jarring.
Yeah.
It's such a jarring experience because up to that point you're like,
you don't even question that
you don't
there's
even
not a man.
think that there's not. Yeah, and it's so different because even though they mention the father in Oranges and there's the pastor, there are pretty much no men throughout the whole story, and which is, I mean, it's so different from Ordinary Girls because Ordinary Girls is littered with men. But I think it's so interesting to think about how that landscape really shaped Jeanette in the sense that, like, she only grew up around women for the most part, and she's so thoroughly influenced by these women. And Jakira with her Ordinary Girls, she's so heavily influenced by her father.
Right.
But she just takes all of her cues about important lessons in her life from her mother and from her abuela, most especially. She has such a close relationship with her grandmother on her dad's side. And I think it's so interesting to think about how that kind of landscape shaped both of them as characters, even though they had clearly very different upbringings.
Right. So kind of just to, finish up our talk of these two novels and their relation to landscape, I'm going to say this one quote from Jakira. On an NPR interview, she said, "I thought everyone lived like this because there were so many other families in El Casero that were dealing with similar things. It wasn't until I was a grown woman looking back at these things and realized how much violence made its way into our everyday lives, into our childhood games, and how much we thought that was normal. It wasn't a pleasant experience," she said on her return visit home after she went back to Puerto Rico after years and years of not being there since her childhood. She said, "I hadn't been there in a very long time because everyone who has ever lived there, who was lucky enough to get out, knows that you don't go back." And so I think that ultimately with these stories and the relationship to the coming of age story, you can always kind of tie experience and how a person grows to that landscape that they are placed in, and whether it be the physical landscape with like Jeanette and how she goes out to solitude on hills, and Diaz and how she kind of escapes to Miami Beach, or the people that are in these landscapes. Ultimately, they kind of come to shape these stories. So yeah.
All right. Thank you for watching CouchLit episode 3, and we will see you guys next time.
Thank you.
Peace out.